Good afternoon, and welcome to the second edition of the Tech Talk by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung's Competence Centre on the Future of Work. Today, the Tech Talk is on AI and the European labour market. Where does this leave diverse and inclusive labour markets? My name is Aida Ponce del Castillo. I'm a senior researcher at the ETUI, and today I'm going to be your host. So I will remind you that German translation is available in the Zoom bottom down here. And the audience can ask questions through the question and answer tool on your toolbox as well. You can also tweet about this event using the hashtag FES Tech-Talk. And a very quick update, we have a tiny news, unfortunately. The speaker from the European Data Protection Supervisor has to cancel his participation due to a family commitment. But today, I am very happy to welcome two of our speakers. The first one, Christina Klocho from the Why Not Lab. Welcome, Christina. And Jan Brauberger from Industrial All, European Trade Union. Welcome, Jan. Now I would like to welcome and hand on to the directors, Matthias Weber. Please, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Aida. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is with utmost pleasure that in the name of these institutions, I can welcome you as well to our second edition of Tech Talk in this year. It was already said, my name is Matthias Weber. I'm in charge of the, not as newly founded Competence Centre anymore. We established the Competence Centre a year ago. So we've been running for almost, a bit longer than a year now. We started to gather experience and nice contacts. Now, if I take a look at the list of participants that we have today, I can't say that I recognize a few faces of being there, since you're already muted or some of your videos are turned off, but I still recognize some names of people that already joined us in the first Tech Talk. Allow me at this point, since Aida already very nicely introduced the topic of today's Tech Talk, what's the entire concept or what our thoughts of the Competence Centre are behind this format of Tech Talks. Now, with these Tech Talks, the Competence Centre aims at explaining current, sometimes possibly complex topics relating to digitalization and the future of work to a broader public of interested people and potential as well as actual stakeholders. Of course, we are very much aware that there are, especially in Brussels, that there are huge amounts of formats like this. But we try to differentiate the Tech Talk and ourselves by doing these discussions, these events in a very limited amount of time. So we're only trying to take up an hour of your precious time. And also we try to do that with speakers, which we perceive to be outstandingly eloquent and very well informed. Now, in this spirit, the first Tech Talk that we organized in October focused on one of the European Union's central legislative acts to shape the platform economy, the Digital Services Act. And we discussed the Digital Services Act together with an expert from the Commission, with a member of Parliament, Timo Wolke, and also with Aida Ponce del Castillo from the European Trade Union Institute. So thank you, Aida, for joining us again today and also enriching the debate with your expertise. Today, as it was mentioned, we are going to talk about changes in the labor markets in general, as well as the European labor market, especially in these times of ongoing or undergoing digital transformation. Now, as economists usually state, the market is a neutral agent, or is supposed to work as a neutral agent or neutrally acting institutions. But we think, and I think, the majority of social scientists thinks similarly, there certainly is a huge imbalance of power, which is in the very nature of capitalistic labor markets. Or to say it with Marx, because I like quoting Karl Marx, since the employer owns the means of production, the workers or the employees are usually free in a double sense. they are free to go to the employer and offer their work, but if they don't want to do that, they're also free to staff. Now, it is our understanding that the ongoing digital transformation, which has been hugely sped up by the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, just think about, for example, about the huge amount of people going again or still working remotely. Now, this digital transformation, if unregulated, the use of techniques or technology that goes, with this digital transformation, if unregulated, certainly increases the power imbalance in favor of the employers. And the growing use of algorithms, which usually are perceived or depicted to be neutral, is one of the driving forces of ever-growing imbalance of power on the labor markets. Therefore, today, we want to look at what role algorithms and people's data play in the job-seeking process and how it can be ensured that further future increases in the power imbalance are avoided and workers or future employees' rights are preserved. Now, therefore, I'm very happy that for today's discussion, we could gain Christina Koklo from the White Knot Lab. Christina already seems to have become a regular guest at other events that other divisions of FES are hosting. So this time we are honored that Christina is joining us, the Competence Centre, for the first time, but hopefully, Christina, this will only be one of many events to come. Christina, as it already has been mentioned, will be complemented by Jan Trauburger, a close colleague, close partner of ours, and a renowned expert on digital policy as well from the European Trade Union Federation, Industry All Europe. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to wrap up by wishing you an insightful tech talk, very constructive discussions, and feel very much invited to discuss with us, the Competence Centre, on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter. The hashtag has already been mentioned. And we, the Competence Centre, would very like to see you around next year, perhaps for the 3rd edition of the Tech Talk coming early next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias, for nicely setting the scene. So I'll invite our speakers to turn on their cameras. Here they are. Fantastic. So let's start with a warm-up question. Christina and Jan, very happy to see you on screen and hoping to have a lot of questions right next to the chat. So just a little bit of a warming question. Maybe Christina. What role does artificial intelligence play in the European labour market, especially in the recruitment process?
Yeah, pass, right? I mean, and the reason why I'm saying that is it's probably playing a huge role. But one of the things that we've experienced across Europe is the lack of transparency around the use of these technologies. Now, we know when we look beyond Europe's borders to the United States and to other regions that AI, or I'd rather say algorithms, are being used, especially in automated hiring systems. Now, of course, they are also being used, especially by the big companies in Europe, but we simply do not have a figure. But I think we can all expect and suspect that the big companies are increasingly using them. And then we see another market which is more using cheaper off-the-shelf solutions from elsewhere. So I think the short answer is more than we would expect.
Jan, please, would you like to give some perspective?
Thank you, Aida. And I actually can only echo what Christina just said. The field is very vague, and we know that companies are deploying artificial intelligence applications, and they are deploying them as we speak. But we really have problems of getting the figures, and we really have problems to really getting into those technologies. But just to give you a few examples of what we actually know, what is out there, we have, for example, CV sorting software that basically scans CVs of applicants, also scans job markets on the internet, for example, LinkedIn, Xing, and basically compares profiles from applicants to the profiles that they have online. And this is obviously hugely problematic because, as we probably will discuss later on in this talk, all those algorithms that are meant to scan the CVs, for example, are mainly biased. So they are fed with historical data, and they basically assume a sort of ideal workforce that the company that deploys this algorithm wants to have or should have, but it's actually only the workforce that the company had in the past. So this is highly problematic because this leads mainly to a reproduction of the existing workforce, and therefore leads to a dominance of male workers, of white workers, and so on. But we're going to discuss this in more detail, I'm pretty sure. Another application, just to give you another example, would, for example, be chatbots that are used by HR departments. For example, if an applicant or a possible applicant has some basic questions towards the company he or she would like to apply at, then they are usually going to send an email, and the chatbot will basically be able to respond to those rather easy questions. In that case, we demand from the companies, obviously, that they make it transparent, that they are communicating with a chatbot at this stage, and that they are not talking to a human being that could also be liable for the things he or she says.
Jan, and all this is very intangible, and of course, as Christina said, non-transparent. So to both of you, so what is actually the role of AI in the labor market, especially if you need to explain this to non-experts?
Do you want me to take that? So I think, so one thing here, right, let's be careful when we talk about AI, because we seem to group everything technological, everything digital under the umbrella of AI, which is artificial intelligence. And I really liked in the introduction that Matthias was talking about algorithms, because this is, I think, a more sort of just or more precise way of talking about these technologies. It's a bunch of algorithms. Now, some of it is artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence is also built on algorithms. But let's really look at algorithms. And algorithms are what the majority of us hated in school, advanced statistics. It is something that a computer is coded to calculate. And what it does is it looks for probabilities. It looks for differences. It looks for algebra. You know, it uses all of this statistics that we just, you know, at least I did, found very mind-boggling. Now, as Jan said, this is fed data. And these data sets can be historical data sets, they can be synthetic data sets, so i.e. data sets that are not based on real action, but just training data sets, for example. Now, what's really important for us to understand how all of this is sort of based on our individual, but also collective actions, is that a lot of the data that is fed into these systems are not just raw pieces of data. Ida was sitting at her computer at this particular time of the day, but it can also be something called data inferences. So aggregates of data that are then used to make a profile on all of us. And the data that are fed into these algorithms can be a bunch of profiles. Are you a slow person? Are you fast-paced? Are you an overachiever? Or whatever the algorithm said, or the data inference says. So think of this as data goes in, you have an algorithm, which is a step-by-step instruction to do something in computer code. And then the instructions to that algorithm. And here Jan was already pointing at some really important things. Let's take your automated hiring system. The algorithm could have been instructed to avoid people with an educational attainment under university level, or avoid women aged 25 to 35, prioritize young men, or whatever. Those instructions are what the algorithm is told to do in its most basic form. So trying to understand this, then we can see, well, we might not be able to see this at work in the labor market, but for those of you who might have been using dating profiles, online dating profiles, the way you get matched with another person all of that is done through algorithms. Are you similar to another person? Do you have similar characteristics? Same when you're watching Netflix. People who have seen this movie also like this movie. So this is where we can see them more in our daily life, but basically that's the sort of the foundation of these technologies.
Thank you, Christina. And Jan, just to continue with this, to what extent does this, what Christina just explained, actually impact workers' opportunities on the labor market?
Well, this is, I think, the one big question that I personally cannot answer, because this is still, I think, this needs to be shown. This needs to be shown from experience, because we do not have that technology yet, except for in very limited use cases. For example, in those very limited HR processes. But I think it is quite clear that in the next 10 years or so, millions of jobs worldwide will be, I think, replaced by automation, but other jobs as well were created. There's an estimation by a World Economic Forum study that basically says that up to 97 million of new jobs will be created in the next 10 years or so. And I think this is an important thing to have in mind when we discuss automation. But then we also have to discuss what this will actually mean, because we're not only talking about HR processes here. Those are probably the use cases that we can talk about the most at the moment, because those are the use cases that are really the ones the most deployed. But at shop floor level, where we as an industrial trade union federation are also very much having our attention on, we see that it's really a bit more difficult to deploy AI as we speak, because the processes are totally different. We see that many industries have not really standardized their processes yet. And if we talk about AI or algorithms, we always talk about standardizing processes. We always talk about automating processes. And this always needs to be the first step. So when we at the moment talk about AI at the shop floor, we mainly talk about issues or use cases such as predictive maintenance, for example, where algorithms are fed with historical data from, let's say, elevators or from any kind of machinery. And the algorithm basically analyzes which parts of a machinery are most likely to break, or at which age an elevator, let's say, usually stops functioning properly, and then manages basically to send out the mechanic in time to make sure that production is not stopped, but that production can continue to work. So those are also use cases that we really have to have in mind when we discuss AI, although they do not really shape the reality of many of our colleagues on the floor at the moment, because it's still rather difficult to automate all those processes at the shop floor, since we, for example, do not really have one technological language that really could be worked on.
Yes, yeah, and before I hand over to Christina, you're talking about mainly applications that are related to safety aspects of AI. Christina, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that we have anecdotal stories from Europe, but we have many stories from less regulated labor markets. We just look at the United States. I also want to flag Lena Denkick at the Data Justice Lab. She's done really good research on automated hiring systems. And as late as our good friend from the Financial Times, Sarah O'Connor, she wrote a really great op-ed. I think it was last week it came out, or maybe this week even, on this AI-driven interviewing of candidates for jobs, which is taking place in the UK apparently now more and more frequently. But let's just go back to sort of, well, how can we see this discrimination? What, if you gather experiences from across the world, what workers are being subject to, and also I would say being harmed by these systems currently, is, for example, as Jan was saying, you now have businesses who scrape your social media data and create profiles. Now, already there, you might be never put into the maybe pile or yes, get an interview pile, because they can see, oh, she seems to be a bit of a rebel, or look at all these photos of her on a strike or something. She might be a unionist. So already there, you get sort of sorted away from being a candidate for this job. But before that even, and this we have seen in the United States, that there are certain job advertisements that particular people no longer see on the internet, because they a priori have been deemed unfit for this and this type of job. So there again, well knowing that the data is biased, because we humans are biased. So every data set, which is majority of that, as Jan said, was on the white man, puts people of color, puts women especially, puts immigrants, the already marginalized, at a disadvantage, especially. So we see that. So we have the a priori discrimination, and then we have these systems, and some of them really awful. I mean, that judge your facial expression, your eye movement. Do you have a trustworthy face or not? Higher view being one of these systems. So there, again, it has shown that these systems can't read certain cultures' facial expressions because they don't follow the norm. I don't know if anybody's here from Finland, but we all know that Finnish people, are not as expressive usually than, for example, I am right now. So there you have discrimination. You have discrimination in relation to, as Jan was mentioning, these scripts that automatically vet applicants through their CVs. There's a type of language or certain words that you put into the no pile because you use them, or you live in a certain postcode or something. So, I could go on, but there's plenty of evidence from around the world of discrimination, big thing, but also other forms of harms that workers are subject to, which we might, come back to later, but they have to do with those workers already in a job, what harms that they are subject to. And just a little hint there, we can all just think of the Amazon fulfillment center workers and how they are paced on by AI.
All right, Christina. So just perhaps building on this aspect of workers being discriminated, Jan, what can you tell about whether is AI being able to open or close the European labor market and being able to promote or prevent diversity? Do you have some views on this?
I think it really depends on how we deploy the technology and how ready the technology is to be deployed. I think especially when we talk about opportunities, about discrimination, we must be aware that there is no real technological solution to problems such as bias. We cannot really have the screw tightened and then everything's fixed. But we have to have really thorough socio-technological debates here, how we want to solve the bias, how we want to tackle all those problems that have just been described by Christina, because this is not really a technical problem in the more narrow sense. So what is important here is that only systems are deployed that are thoroughly checked, and not only checked by the manufacturer, for example, but also checked by neutral authorities or by competent authorities designated by, for example, the European Union or the member states. If we talk about deploying AI at the workplace, for sure, the works councils, workers' representatives, and the trade unions should have a say as well. And I think that we really need to have collective agreements in place as soon as we are talking about AI processing workers' data and processing personal data. For example, if a company wants to deploy an algorithm or any kind of machinery that has embedded AI with that might perform safety functions. The workers obviously need to be aware of the technology that is at stake here. The works councils or the workers' representatives, the trade unions, need to be aware of the technology, and they must be able to understand it. That means that we haven't gained anything when the management just hands over the algorithm and says, "Dear Works Council, please read it and say, yes, we can deploy the technology." But no, I think that we also cannot expect our colleagues, the Works Council's representatives, to be experts on data science, but they need to have the means, and this means the financial means, to hire an independent and neutral data scientist, for example, who then can discuss with management the algorithm that is at stake, and then explain the algorithm to the works councils, to the trade unions here, to discuss with them the means, and also, for example, the limitations that the technology has. Because since we are talking about a very difficult technology here, that's very difficult to grasp, since often also management do not really know what the capacities, but also the limitations of those technologies are. I think we must not introduce such a technology without a proper involvement and without an educated involvement of workers' representatives here.
Yeah, and just let me pick on this involvement of management by bringing the first question of our audience, and please put more them on the chat. So the question, Jan, is about risks. So how do we deal with the risk that a human HR decision maker can reduce their own liability of decision making by using the AI or machine learning as their only decision reference, even if it's biased? What would you answer to this question?
That is an excellent question, and we haven't found a solution to that either. But I think it is important that we really have clear rules after which a HR responsible person in that case should really follow the recommendations by the algorithms, and after which not. And I think it should be entirely clear that there must be no algorithm in place that has the competency to terminate the employment relationship or to decide on the advancement in one's personal career. So we really need to have clear guidelines in place. The algorithm may recommend decisions, but the HR official really needs to have a reason of his or her own how to deal with the person he or she is responsible for. So the algorithm may recommend a decision, but the liability for that decision must, under any circumstances, remain with the HR official, who is a human.
So with that, now I invite you to jump to the topic of workers' rights in the digital age. Christina, I think you have a lot of experience in this field, and there's a question for you. Does the GDPR fully protect job seekers from algorithm matching? And how can GDPR in this context be improved?
Another great question. Can I just go back to the first one, though? I just want to add a comment to that. There is a very clear solution to that question of whether you can hide yourself behind a system and then shed yourself of liability. The answer to that is no. This must never be possible. And I was actually discussing this at a big event yesterday on AI and human rights. It always has to be the deploying company who has the responsibility and liability for the use of any systems that they are deploying, right? And this is key, because Jan mentioned this as well. Management does not always know and fully understand the social, technical impacts, potential, and real of the systems they are deploying. And we see in a lot of companies how the managerial sort of balance of power is also changing. Maybe the IT department brought in this particular tool, and then it's been diffused to the central HR and then used by a local HR person who then is really amongst them responsible for the data, the harms, the impacts, and so forth. That's their problem. I think from the workers' side, we should really claim If you are deploying this system, you are responsible and you are liable. End of story. So that I think is pretty clear. Now, going back to the other question, which is another great question, whether job applicants are protected in relation to this inferencing. Now, there's debates about this. I've just been working with FEPS around a paper on workers' data rights, and one of the people who was also advising on that report was Paul Niemitz from the European Commission, who was one of the top negotiators of the GDPR. He claims that workers would be, because their personal data, i.e. their competencies, are judged against an inference. But then you have Professor Sandra Wachter from the Oxford University, who has written numerous articles on the right to reasonable inferences, she calls it. What she and her co-author, Bert Mittelstadt, say is that we actually have no rights in the GDPR to know when we are subject to inferences that are not directly built on our own personal data. So to make that a little bit less abstract, let's say it has been proven that customers prefer a female voice with an accent from this and this postcode and this part of the country, and more trustworthy in a customer call center job. Well, then, what would be the likelihood that maybe an immigrant background man from a different postcode with a heavy accent will get that job? Will he be, declined because he is untrustworthy according to the algorithm? Now, does he have a right to know that he is subject to that inference? I would say, and here I'm in agreement with Sandra Wachter, that you don't have that right in the GDPR. And we therefore, and the majority of us, don't forget, are daily subject to numerous algorithms that we just simply don't know about. So here, I think there's a particular weakness in the GDPR in relation to the right to know when we are being subject to algorithmic inferences, which are not directly built on our own personal data.
If I may jump in on GDPR as well, Aida. Cool. We have done a bit of work on GDPR as well at Industrial Europe, and we have identified particularly 2 articles that are of our concern. And basically both of them go back to what Matthias kindly introduced as the imbalance of power between the workers and the employer. And one of the main principle in GDPR is basically the point that individuals should give consent to the processing of their data. And this is basically what we do on an everyday basis. When you are online, for example, we have to accept all those nice cookies that are all over the internet. But in an employment relationship, this is obviously more difficult, and this also often leads to problems where people are forced to give consent to the processing of data, which they would not do in their private life, simply because they either do not want to have an argument with their boss, or if they, for example, want to be employed in the first place. So what we would recommend here is that we would not consider individual consent as enough in the employment relationship, but that we would also and always need the collective consent for the processing of worker-related data, meaning a collective agreement either between the management and the workers' representatives or the trade union, of course. And the other point where we have identified a weakness in GDPR is the whole issue of data that is being fed into machine learning processes. For example, when we talk about personal sensitive data. The processing of personal sensitive data, for example, one's religious belief, trade union membership, health, and so on, the processing of the current state of such data is obviously prohibited by GDPR, Article 9, I believe it is. But what is not prohibited yet, hopefully, is actually the guessing, the anticipation of such data using indirect data. So, for example, when a colleague on the shop floor always gets into arguments with other colleagues, or usually comes late to work or so, the algorithm may predict that this person may suffer from a burnout or will suffer from a burnout in the future. And this could obviously lead to further problems. Or if a colleague is often in contact with the shop steward, the algorithm may predict that this person, if he or she is not already a trade union member, may become a trade union member. And these sorts of prediction using machine learning technologies is not prohibited by GDPR yet. And we think that this is something that we should discuss when we discuss the further deployment of machine learning.
Yeah, GDPR is just a fascinating topic, and I really believe that it has so many useful things that trade unions can use. But I think I have to make a position on the issue of consent. Consent is not a valid legal basis to be used in the employment context. So I don't know why trade unions are worried, because it's just employers cannot use it. Simply like that. Informed consent is not a valid legal basis to use and process employees' personal data. So there you have it. A gift to you if you didn't know about it. So you have perhaps need to focus your discussions in inferred personal data, which indeed it's problematic. Because of course many decisions or / recommendations, because I don't like to use the word that machines make decisions on people, because it doesn't happen. So just coming back to GDPR, well, how can you improve the text? I would like to hear both of you's opinions.
Yeah, no, so Jan, Article 29 Working Party wrote that informed consent in the workplace relation was not a valid legal processing or legal basis for processing. So that's very, very important, because actually in all other data protection laws in the world, they rely on informed consent for processing workers' data. So here we have to help our colleagues around the world, because this is actually one of the strengths of the GDPR. So how could the GDPR be improved? Well, I think Jan mentioned another really interesting point here. How do we move from the individual rights to collective rights? This for me it would be key to what Matthias said in the beginning. This is a question of power. So if we want to empower the workers, how do we give them a collective right of action over the data, and importantly, the inferences that are being made on the workers, how these inferences are used for what purposes? We have certain really good examples. The Teamsters in the US have negotiated in the collective agreement that certain data can be collected, but then they have co-defined with management for what purposes this data can be used, and therefore define the red lines for what it can't be used for example, employee evaluation and so forth. There's also a similar article in the Danish collective agreement in the insurance sector. So there, I think we need really strong improvements. Then we have to, and this gets a little bit hairy now, but linked to digital trade discussions happening in bilateral, multilateral trade agreements, there's a huge threat here to actually the strength of the GDPR in relation to a lot of governments, and the EU here talking in two tongues, because they're actually talking against the GDPR, wanting the free flow of data unrestricted and a lot more. The short of the long of all of that is that we really should have a right to know under what jurisdiction is our data as workers stored. Who has then the right, and this is particularly important in relation to all of these technologies, or the vast majority of them are not developed by the individual employer, they're third-party systems. If that third party is outside of Europe, who is having control of the data, for example? We should know. My last point in relation to that is we should also know what's happening to the data and the inferences made. Is it sold? Is it sold to whom? Is it passed on and outside of out of the jurisdiction of Europe? Here, I again draw inspiration from the Finance Sector Union in Ireland, who managed to get into an agreement, which I really think was amazing, with one of the banks in Ireland, that the bank committed to never selling data or data sets that include the workers' personal data. This for me is, a highlight of doing what Susanne Suboff, the acclaimed author, says we should stop markets in human futures, i.e. the buying and trading in the human profiles. And they took a big step there with that agreement. So across what I call the data lifecycle at work, we have very, very clear points where we could improve on the GDPR. But Ida, I want to support you. I am a fan of the GDPR, and it actually includes so many rights to workers that a lot of unions should be more active in using to balance out this power imbalance, which non-action is leading to.
Thank you, Christina. And I would like to take another question from the audience on, again, candidate profiling and HR resources. And maybe Jan can or you, Christina, any of you can answer to it. So I'll read it out loud. Algorithms seem to be operating with the same biases that human HR persons are operating with. For example, candidate profiling. So the question is, how are AI-driven recruitment or performance management systems more harmful than human-driven ones, if at all?
Well, the point that management usually does, or industry in general, is that those technologies are not more harmful than the human, because the human obviously has the same biases that have been fed into the algorithm if the algorithm has been fed with historical data. So this is up to contestation, obviously. What is important for us here is that the algorithm must not be the sole instance of decision-taking. There must always be a human in command who reads the output of the algorithm, who checks the output of the algorithm, and then takes the decision if the recommendations of the algorithms are followed or not. But we have to have in mind that the algorithms are not perfect. The human beings are not perfect, that's for sure. And maybe at a later stage, at some point, algorithms may be really advanced and may only have a minor bias in their decision taking, but this is not where we are at the moment. So what I said in the beginning, I think, is the important point here, that algorithms must not be treated like technology in the narrow sense, but that we have to have thorough socio-technological discussions at stake here, how to improve those algorithms, how to really work on neutral data sets, on complete data sets, on neutral data sets, whatever that means, but that has to be negotiated, and then really agree amongst the humans which algorithms are really deployed and which not, and to what extent the human really then has to work with the output that the algorithm produces.
Thank you, Jan. And just let me take one more question from the audience on GDPR before we jump to another fascinating topic, which is the AI Act. And we need to go really fast into this. So now that we know that consent doesn't apply in employment relationships, so the question from the audience is, for Christina perhaps, what about the scope of employers' legitimate interest to process workers' data?
Philippa, that had to come from you. That is such a great question. Now, there's nothing in the GDPR that actually limits that scope. What it does is it limits what type of data or how they should treat certain types of data. Jan mentioned sensitive data, for example. Now, this leads back to the manager's right to govern, right? The prerogative, management's prerogative, their right to govern. I think, of course, this is where collective agreements have their merit above all else. And this is putting the red lines down. If you remember, now, some of you have seen this, some of you haven't, but the data life cycle at work really goes in and says what sources of data is management relying on, external and internal? Do we agree on that? Here, I think, again, you can frame the purposes, their legitimate interests, by actually defining the red lines in the processing, the data sources. But importantly, this is not just about the data. It is the instructions to the algorithms, the order of those instructions. What has the algorithm been told to sort, reject, prioritize, and so forth? This is very, very key, because those instructions are, of course, built into the very ethos of the system. And it is this that we, like an onion, want to unpeel and get into the nitty-gritty on. So to that, I would say this is where strong unions with good red lines can, maybe in the more positive terms, sort of co-design the purpose of the algorithm.
Thank you, Christina. I personally have a response to that, and
yeah,
yes,
go for it.
GDPR has an answer to that, and that's the purpose of the data processing and the minimization, both key principles that any collector and processor have to follow. So, well, with that, maybe
now because this is so, Ida, thank you for mentioning it, because this is key. Right, for all the unions on the call here, because the principles that are foundational in the GDPR are absolutely wonderful. Data minimalization being one, informed consent, another, not in the workplace, but as a consumer or a citizen. But a third one is the requirement of transparency. Articles 13 to 15, for example. If unions claimed or held management responsible to especially Article 13, then we would overcome one of the biggest things I hear from a lot of shop stewards is we don't know what systems are in place. If management were living up to the principle of transparency, you would know. And if they had read carefully Article 29 Working Party's recommendation that data protection impact assessments in the workplace should be conducted in consultation with, quote, a representative sample of employees, end quote, then again, we would know, and we would have an entry point into defining these red lines. So thanks for mentioning those core principles, because they are really, really important.
Yes, and I think GDPR has a lot of answers to the questions, but I see that we're getting into practicalities to be solved. And with this, I would like to make the link with the AI Act, if I may, Jan, or unless you want to make a very quick, yes, it's just because we're running and we really need to cover that one. So, so we have it, it's in our doorstep, the AI Act. And do you think that this European regulation will help to solve all these problems that we are talking about at the workplace? Jan, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yes and no. Let me start with the positive aspects. It's really good that we now have the proposal at the table. I think it's really good that the Commission has tabled really a landmark legislation that can be regarded as such. And that really answers a lot of questions that we have been discussing in the past, or at least try to find answers for. But what we have realized is that the AI Act does not necessarily focus on the employment relationship or on the workplace in general. And this is due to the fact that the Commission claims that this would be an internal market regulation, and that therefore the employment relationship should not be covered by such a regulation. Well, I do not find this necessarily convincing, because I think that this also is very much the issue of the political powers at stake here. And this particular issue that the regulation does not touch upon the world of work really is also an issue in other parts. For example, the draft AI Act does not really address the issues of liability, for example. And the Commission says, well, we are going to revise the liability products directive. Absolutely right, they're going to do that, but they have now postponed it again, and it's really not clear what they are going to come up with. And they're going to vote on the AI Act before they're going to vote on the revised product liability directive. So it's not really clear what we will be ending up with in the end. And since the employment relationship is not really covered by the draft regulation, it's really difficult to assess whether all those questions that we have just discussed will indeed be covered, will indeed be answered by the regulation or not. But what we realize, and what is really a problem, is that the Commission is working with a so-called risk-based approach, where they define different layers of risk categories. And I think that those risk categories are really not granular enough. They really put a lot of different AI applications into one risk layer, so to speak, and that does not allow for increments or for really addressing particular issues of particular applications in more detail. Just to give you one example, Christina already mentioned applications such as facial recognition applications, emotional recognition application, recognition applications. All those applications are highly unreliable because they always work with data. And as we discussed already, this data is highly biased, or maybe highly biased. But these kind of applications are only discussed or considered as applications that pose a minimal risk, and as therefore only subject to a number of, let's say, transparency obligations. And this, I think, is not really enough to cover applications that are very relevant in the employment relationship, because applications such as the emotional recognition software is already in place, for example, for telephone agents, and they basically recommend the workers how to behave on the phone. And this is therefore a difficult software to deploy without having strong protection goals in place. I hope this covers the question a bit.
Thank you, Jan. Christina, I would really like to hear your views about the AI Act.
Yeah, I'm going to do it short, but I'm going to do it by plugging your work, and it's in the chat now, because I really think that Ida, the stuff that you're doing on this front is just simply amazing and very, very clear. Now, I agree with what Jan said, and but I want to ask or just lift a fundamental aspect of the EU AI Act, which puzzles me. The GDPR is a rights-based piece of regulation. The draft EU AI Act is a risk-based. Now, this is significant. It's hoping to build trust by minimizing risk or something in that level. Why does it not build on the GDPR? Why has it not had its foundation in a rights-based approach? Now, that's one thing. The second thing, highly criticizable, workers are not mentioned if you do a control find in the whole text once. This, for me, just says it all, doesn't it? Here we have a world where the use of digital systems in workplaces is increasing manyfold, and workers are not mentioned. What happens to the respect of the social model in Europe, to social dialogue, etc., etc.? Again, as Jan has said, a highly criticizable thing is that the impact assessments, can be self-assessments by the companies. This belief that they can do unilaterally non-enforceable assessment of the risks and potential benefits and impacts of the tools they are deploying is, for me, number one, false on two fronts. Number one, it assumes management are capable unilaterally of doing that risk assessment, where I call for it to be a rights assessment. Everything has proven that management do not have those skills to do this properly. And secondly, why does it not invite for the workers' point of view? This is key. You know, shop stewards, workers have always been the ones with the ear closest to the ground. We know what are the lived impacts and harms of particular groups of workers or individuals. So this total avoidance of the social dialogue, this total neglect of the key role of workers in assessing, not just once, but periodically, these tools, and then the divergence from the GDPR means for me really that whole EU AI Act should be rejected as is.
Christina, I would like to pick on your idea of a right-based approach, and in a more practical way. I want to bring in a question from the audience. Please pace more before we finish with this webinar. And I would like to ask you, how can trade unions ensure that their agreements reflect the wide variety of views among the members about their data processing and algorithmic management at work?
Ah, that's from Philippa. Well, I mean, here I think here we could use and tap into technology for good purposes. This is about democracy inside the union, right? How do we ensure that we are picking up on all the members' concerns, voices, fears, but also, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So how can we help the workers to sort of make those interconnections? Here, technology and you know, we've used a tool called Thought Exchange, which I think was a really democratically building tool to make sure that the union leaders, the shop stewards, the organizers are in line with their members' concerns and wishes. So absolutely, I think innovative use of responsible technology is the way forward here.
Thank you, Christina. Oh, sorry, Jan, please.
Yeah, if I may, thank you. I can only agree. I think this is really standard trade union work that we have to do here. We really need to be, as trade unions, in contact with our members, and not only to get the ideas or their thoughts from them. This is obviously important, but also to translate all those issues that we're discussing at the moment with them, and to have the discussions with them, what that would mean for them, or what they think it would mean for them, for example, if they feed the data, how they work, into the machinery, into the algorithm, what that would basically have consequences for their work that they're doing, for their everyday work that they are doing on the shop floor, if the algorithm takes more and more of their responsibilities, and basically how it will change then their everyday life at the shop floor. Those are all important information that we need to collect, that we need to discuss with our members at the shop floor. And this is obviously something that cannot be done from others for us. But this is really the day-to-day trade union work that we have to do here, that we really need to be connected with our members on the ground and really have an idea of what is going on. And this will also help us to better understand which technologies are actually deployed at the moment at the shop floor, and to really get a better understanding of in which direction technology is currently heading.
Jan, and to close really this to be continued Tech Talk number 2, I would like to close with 2 questions, one for Jan and one for Christina. And the one for Jan would be, in the framework of GDPR, AI Act, liability rules, platform rules, and everything that will come in the next few months, Jan, for as a closing remark and answer, what needs to be done at the European level to provide more transparency and rights to the workers and job seekers?
Yeah, I think what we need is a clear signal from the European Commission, from the European Parliament, from the European Council, that trade unions are legitimate actors, that social dialogue is the key instrument for us to negotiate on data processing, on the deployment of new kinds of technology at the workplace. I think this is the one key issue where we really need to have a clear position taken from policymakers that social dialogue, that working with trade unions is nothing that is really to be seen in the context of the 19th century, in the context of industrialization, but that this is really something where trade unions will continue to play an important role. This will, on the one hand, obviously encourage people to join the union because they will then obviously see also trade unions in a different light than many of them might still perceive trade unions. But this will also obviously put additional pressure, and we need that pressure, to be honest. That will also put additional pressure on the employers, on managements, to really take this serious and to really take works councils or accept works councils and trade unions as the interlocutors that they should be accepting. And this will also lead to an increased role of social dialogue and sectoral social dialogue at European level, because this is actually something where we also would need a stronger voice from the European Commission that actually supports trade union federations, and also the employers here.
Thank you, Jan. And Christina, last but not least, your question for the closing of the webinar: what would be the possible scenarios if there will be no action at European level?
Oh gosh, I think we should all just watch what's the name of that series now, Black Mirror, and then we can see what the future will hold. No, on a serious note, I am very concerned of the current quantification, commodification of citizens and workers, and the portrayal of history that we are currently being subject to because our politicians are not regulating. So for me, it would be a very bleak future, a very narrow, very exclusive labour market, but also society as we move towards individualized insurance prices, etc., in the labour market as well, very narrow labour markets. I cannot stress how important it is that unions really get on top of this now and stop this quantification/commodification of workers.
All right, thank you, Christina, and thank you, Jan. It has been a really lively conversation between the three of us and with the audience. Yeah. With that prospective look into the future of AI, of our governance, of the whole governance of our fundamental rights, I would like to thank you, to the audience, to the interpreters, and to the organization for having organized this second Tech Talk. We're going to have another one. Well, FES is going to have another one at the beginning of the year. Please follow them under the Twitter at FES_FOW to stay updated and to get the new date for the third Tech Talk. Thank you again, really, for the very nice conversation, for the great and difficult questions, and for bringing up us all into this topic. And I wish you a very nice afternoon, and then I hand over to the organizers. Thank you very much.